Hello, welcome back to another episode of the yes. Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Software with Tactics podcast. Today we're talking about nicotine, apparently. Whether it is going to be smoking or other ingestion, I do not know, but I'm looking forward to it because there is a bit of a backstory around for me why this is interesting that I'm also going to tell you then. But it is, again, I actually want to say obviously, but it's not that obvious, is it? A Huberman lab video, so how nicotine impacts your brain and enhances focus with Dr. Andrew Huberman. And as I said, from the Huberman Lab podcast or the Huberman Lab Clips channel. Also something to keep in mind or, maybe keep in mind that there is a Clips channel. So if you're not having that much time to go through 2-hour episodes, nor listen to 2-hour episodes, which is completely understandable, you might check this out.
It's really simple. Nicotine only binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and there are a bunch of different ones on a bunch of different tissues. And the differences in those receptors dictate what sorts of effects the nicotine will have on those tissues. So let's talk about what those effects are. And let's do that by dividing the effects of nicotine into effects on the brain, so everything from the neck up, and on the body, the so-called central nervous system and the periphery. Although I want to point out that your spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So in fairness to the reality, your brain and spinal cord are all central nervous system. Everything else is considered the periphery. Now, there are a lot of different nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, but for those of you that want to know, you aficionados, or if you're ultra curious about this, the main effects of nicotine in the brain are mediated by nicotine binding to the so-called alpha-4 beta-2 receptor. Alpha-4 beta-2 receptor. Even if you don't care about receptor subtypes, that's going to come up later when we discuss why nicotine suppresses appetite. In fact, one of the major reasons why people don't want to quit smoking, or they quit smoking or another form of ingesting nicotine and then they relapse, they go back to smoking or ingesting nicotine in some other way, is because indeed nicotine will increase metabolism and reduce hunger in large part by binding to this alpha-4 beta-2 receptor in a particular area of the brain. We're going to return to that in a little bit, but if you've
even though, and I think it is something we all have seen before regarding certain people, there are definitely some I'd say smokers explicitly, that are pretty thin. And I have heard it before, and I have heard also people talking about it being a reason why they do smoke. I don't know if it's I don't know if when you're calculating it through, if it makes any sense regarding, I just thought about like, okay, I'm starting smoking just because I don't want to buy myself food. So I'm just saving some money. I don't know if this works since cigarettes are actually quite expensive. I mean, it really depends on where you're living, of course, but they're quite expensive. And I don't know what the medical bills are going to be like with all the drawbacks that you're going to have explicitly from smoking. So, of course, you could also just, take some other stuff with nicotine where you might be mitigating those risks, but, still cancer and all the other shit. I don't know if it is smart. I don't know if it makes sense just regarding the whole, reducing hunger and faster metabolism thing. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, there's some shit like COPD that is really fucked up, and it is always quite interesting when you are at certain hospitals. Of course, there's certain specialized hospitals also in my area where they just, specialize on lung function and COPD and whatever. And it is always quite interesting to see those people with their little oxygen package thingy thing being outside of the hospital and smoking. And it is always quite bizarre, to be honest, but I don't feel like that it makes too much sense just regarding hunger and just regarding maybe saving money by not spending it on food.
You've ever heard that nicotine kills the appetite? Indeed, it does. It's not the behavior of smoking itself. It's not because you always have a cigarette in your mouth that you're not eating more food, although I suppose that might be a minor effect. There are direct effects of nicotine on both appetite, that is, it reduces appetite, and direct effects on metabolism, that is, it increases metabolism through its effects on some other areas of the brain and body we'll talk about in a moment. Now, within the brain, nicotine binds to this alpha-4 beta-2 receptor in various locations in the brain. And there are 3 and maybe a 4th that we'll talk about neurochemical effects of nicotine after you ingest it. First things first, when you ingest nicotine by smoking nicotine-containing tobacco, or if you place tobacco in contact with the mucosal lining of the nasal passages of the mouth, it takes about 2 to 15 minutes for that nicotine to enter the bloodstream. Smoking hits the bloodstream faster, vaping even faster, I should mention, for a variety of reasons. And placing tobacco directly in contact with the mucosal lining is going to be the slowest. Now, as I mentioned before, nicotine gets into the bloodstream, and then because nicotine can pass through the so-called blood-brain barrier, the BBB, which is basically a fence around the brain, because it can pass through the blood-brain barrier, it's going to have very rapid effects on the brain in these 4 major categories of neurochemicals and neural circuits. The first of those categories, this is a very important one. This is one that was brought up in the episode on dopamine, motivation, and drive. And I think not just all scientists, but all human beings should know that within their brain, they have what is called the mesolimbic reward pathway. The mesolimbic reward pathway, if you just want to call it the dopamine reward pathway, is, as the name suggests, a set of...
By the way, just because he's mentioning it, yesterday, as I was on Andrew's website from the Huberman Lab podcast, where he's having a newsletter, which is really amazing. I really enjoy the newsletter, and I really think the newsletter is quite the great thing. The latest one of them that he's also publishing there on the website, so not only as a newsletter, is about dopamine, and it is very, very, very precise in terms of there is not a lot of fluff. It is just, okay, this is what's happening, and this is how you can leverage that, and this is the tool that you can be using. Just everything around dopamine. It was really amazing to see, and just an amazing newsletter, at least in my point of view. So definitely something worth checking out.
Set of connections between a brain area called the ventral tegmental area. You don't have to remember the names of these things, of course, but if you want to, that's fine too. The ventral tegmental area, or VTA, connects to another area called the nucleus accumbens. Now, here's what's very important. Nicotine triggers the release of dopamine from the nucleus accumbens. This is what gives nicotine its rewarding properties. It increases motivation. It tends to give a not so subtle, but very transient increase in feelings of well-being and alertness and motivation. And that's because of the increase in dopamine caused by nicotine directly within the nucleus accumbens. Nicotine also triggers the release of certain neurochemicals from the ventral tegmental area itself, and those impinge on nucleus accumbens and increase dopamine levels further. This is what makes the rewarding properties, or sometimes referred to as the reinforcing properties of nicotine, so powerful. This is why so many billions of people ingest nicotine in one form or another. It's also why nicotine is so hard to quit, because there's a potent increase in dopamine from multiple neural circuit pathways within this mesolimbic reward circuitry. And
this really high spike is probably also leading to a really, really deep valley. And I don't know, it's just, I think, explains why people are feeling so shit when they're trying to quit smoking, because they're not having this increased dopamine. They're not having those dopamine spikes or elevated levels. And it is really shit. I know it kind of for me sounds like, I mean, probably any other drug, because I think they all do spike dopamine in one or the other way. But it's quite the thing. I mean, and I always wondered, like, why are people smoking? You know, you're not quite getting anything out of it. Besides, yeah, of course, you know, you're just, you know, not that hungry. And I also knew about the whole focus thing, you know, enhanced focus that Andrew's also gonna talk about, I think, in a second. But not the whole dopamine thing. I wasn't really aware of that.
Now, within the mesolimbic reward circuit.
And I think regarding that, stopping to smoke or trying to stop smoking, leveraging all the things that Andrew's talking about, dopamine regarding, for example, not layering things. So I don't know, maybe, I mean, there's a reason why people who smoke also drink a lot of coffee, since coffee or caffeine does increase, or at least increased maybe the amount, but definitely the potency, any one of those two things, of dopamine receptors, which is also great for everyone else. But when having more dopamine receptors, and I think also just, higher dopamine levels by ingesting caffeine, and also added with just nicotine, I think it's quite the dangerous thing.
There's an interesting feature. There are accelerators that essentially push out more dopamine, get more dopamine released, and there are brakes of the so-called GABAergic variety. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. You don't need to know too much about it to just understand that nicotine both increases dopamine, but also decreases the activity of GABA. And so this is like pushing on the accelerator for dopamine, but also removing the brake. So there's a two-pronged effect of nicotine on reinforcement reward dopamine related pathways, the feel good motivation pathways. And that is an increase in dopamine and a decrease in GABA. And again, that's all mediated through this mesolimbic reward pathway involving the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. So if you can conceptualize even just 5% of what I just told you, or even if you can just remember nicotine increases dopamine and that's why it feels so good, it makes you want more of it, you will have everything you need to know in mind in order to understand both why nicotine is so highly used and indeed abused, why it's so hard to quit, and that will point to avenues as to how to quit or reduce intake, and it also points to how nicotine can actually be used in an antidepressant way, should you choose, and we will talk about what the various criteria are for choosing that. But just understand nicotine increases motivation, it decreases negative feelings of mood, it increases positive feelings of mood and motivation.
And I think also higher dopamine equals to higher focus on one level. Might be wrong about that, or might just, not get the specifics right here. But Andrew definitely also has an episode on focus setting, increasing focus and whatever. And I think dopamine does play a role in there. But yeah, with that being said, I'm hopefully going to see you next time. And I also dearly hope that I've been able, or at least Andrew's been able, to shine some light on certain ideas and things. And I'm hopefully going to see you next time. Bye-bye. And now we have to